Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, we're jumping straight into the source material you've shared with us.
Yeah, quite a stack here.
Definitely. It's all focused on the state of the Web3 industry in 2025.
Right.
Our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear.
Yeah.
Cut through the noise, pull out the key insights on status, issues, investment prospects, based only on what these sources are telling us.
And looking through them, you really get this this dual narrative, right? On one hand, you've got this super fast innovation really pushing boundaries, but then it's hitting these really persistent fundamental challenges head on.
Like what specifically?
We're seeing major tech trends getting a lot of buzz AI getting woven into decentralized systems, DePINs emerging.
DePINs, right. Decentralized Physical Infrastructure Network.
Exactly. And the big push to tokenize real-world assets, RWA, that's huge. But, the sources are also very clear about the stuff that just won't go away. Security is still a massive headache. User experience, often still a mess. And the whole global regulatory picture is still very much evolving.
Okay, let's unpack that tension, starting with the big picture numbers you gave us. The market size predictions for Web3 in 2025. They're interesting just because they vary.
They do. Your sources put it somewhere between, $4.62 billion and $6.15 billion just for this year.
That range itself tells a story, doesn't it?
It really does. Shows the market still, figuring itself out. Early days. Different reports just count things slightly differently. But the thing every source lines up on is the growth rate, the CAGR.
Compound annual growth rate.
Yeah. We're talking seriously aggressive numbers, like 40–50% growth expected. And not just for 2025, but looking out towards 2030, even beyond.
40 to 50% CAGR.
Yeah, that's definitely eye-watering. So why? Why this expectation of explosive growth, especially with all the challenges? What are the main drivers in these sources?
Well, a core one that comes up again and again is just fundamental user demand.
Yeah.
People are getting more concerned about owning their data, about privacy.
Right. They're looking for options beyond the old model where, big platforms control everything. Web3's promise of decentralization, self-sovereignty, that really speaks to that desire.
It's sort of a pushback against the current way things are done online.
Exactly. And then there's the sheer scale of the physical world getting connected.
The Internet of Things, IoT.
Right. It's massive. The sources project something like 23.3 billion IoT connections by 2025. That's just a vast amount of data, of interaction points that decentralized tech, like those DePINs, could potentially manage better, more efficiently, more transparently.
Plus, there's just the general idea, the sort of philosophical push towards decentralization itself.
Absolutely. That's kind of underpinning a lot of this.
Yeah.
And importantly, the sources point to the fusion with AI, which we'll definitely get into, and the whole metaverse concept as big growth contributors too.
Okay, interesting mix. So user demand, IoT, AI, metaverse. Where is this growth actually happening, geographically speaking?
Right now, North America's got the biggest slice of the pie, somewhere between 35% and maybe 41.5% market share in 2024. A lot of that's driven by innovation hubs, Silicon Valley.
Okay.
But the sources add a really important bit of nuance here. Historically, the U.S. regulatory scene has been uncertain, maybe held things back a bit.
So innovation happening almost despite the regulation, potentially.
Kind of, yeah. But the expectation you see in these reports is for potentially friendlier regulation coming in 2025. If that happens, it could really light a fire under North American growth, maybe pull in even more global money.
Huh. A potential turning point there.
And what about Asia Pacific? Flagged as the fastest growing market.
Yeah, APAC is booming. It's a slightly different picture there, though. You've got huge populations, obviously, rapid digitization happening everywhere, and crucially, often more strategic, sometimes top-down government support.
Well, you see countries like Korea really pushing Web3 in gaming. China and Japan have strengths in blockchain for fintech. And then places like Hong Kong, Singapore, they're actively setting themselves up as Web3 hubs. Favorable policies to lure in companies and talent.
So a more strategic national level approach in APAC versus the sort of bottom-up innovation-led thing in North America, though maybe that's changing with regulation.
Yeah, it highlights these different global strategies for bringing Web3 into the mainstream economy.
Okay, let's shift from market size to actual activity, users, developers. Is it real engagement or just hype? Your sources mentioned daily unique active wallets, UAWs, hitting some big numbers, like 24.6 million late last year from Dapradar, and others says 26.4 million. That sounds like massive percentage growth.
Huge growth, yeah. And if you look inside that, decentralized finance is a big piece. One source says 32% of UAW, maybe 7 million wallets. And the Web3 social scene, Over 10 million daily active users by mid-2024. So on the surface, yeah, looks like activity is exploding.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. What do these big numbers actually mean? Is it deep engagement or something else?
This is where the sources really start to dig a bit deeper. While those raw UAW numbers look great, they definitely question the quality of that activity.
Yeah.
Meaning a lot of it might just be, quick interactions, maybe people farming airdrops, pure speculation, or just connecting a wallet because an app requires it, not because they're using it deeply. You see that tension when you look at other metrics like NFT trading volume and sales. Those were actually down in 2024 compared to 2023, like 19% and 18% down.
Right. So getting someone to connect a wallet is one thing, but getting them to stick around and really use something in a meaningful way,
Yeah.
that's still the bottleneck.
Exactly. It reveals that challenge of converting that initial flicker of interest into sustained valuable participation. That's the hurdle.
What about the people building this stuff? The developers, how's that looking? Often a good leading indicator.
Yeah, developer activity shows a really interesting pattern. Total active crypto devs. They actually dipped around October 2023, down to like 19,300, a 27% drop then. But then by November 2024, the number had bounced back up to over 23,600.
Okay, so a dip and a recovery in the overall count.
Yes, but here's the really crucial insight buried in these sources. While the total number went up and down, the number of senior developers,
The experienced ones.
right, those with like 2 or more years under their belt, that number actually grew consistently. It suggests maybe a kind of market maturation, a shakeout perhaps. Less experienced folks might have left, but the core experienced talent stuck around and even grew.
That's a key distinction. Quality over just quantity, maybe.
Yeah.
Where are these devs based?
The U.S. still has the biggest share, around 18.8% in late 2024, though the sources note its share is kind of slipping a bit. India is a strong second, about 11.7%. And looking bigger picture, the total Web3 workforce is estimated at over 460,000 people now,
Wow.
with a massive 100,000 added just in the last year reported.
100,000 jobs in a year. That's serious growth. But the sources still say there's a talent shortage.
They do, because the demand is growing even faster, especially for those really specialized roles, Solidity devs, Rust devs, security experts, compliance people.
Right.
The supply just isn't keeping up. It's a major bottleneck.
Yeah.
Leads to high salaries. The average for devs is around 160K. And you see specific needs, like Japan needing over 20,000 Web3 pros. They're even using AI in recruiting to try and find people.
So the industry's hiring like crazy, but it's still not enough to meet the demand.
Exactly. And that shortage directly impacts how fast things can get built and, crucially, how well they can fix those big problems like security and UX we keep talking about.
Okay, let's shift gears. The core tech trends shaping 2025. What are the big ones jumping out from your sources?
Number one, probably the hottest area right now is this fusion of AI and Web3. Your sources talk about AI being used for all sorts of things: boosting efficiency, improving security, personalizing user experiences, automating processes within dApps.
Making Web3 work better, essentially.
Yeah, and AI-assisted dev tools are speeding things up too. It's seen as helpful for due diligence, empowering smart DAOs, things like that.
And the funding reflects that heat, right?
Yeah.
And the numbers are huge.
Oh, massive. Over $1.8 billion flowed into AI plus Web3 projects in 2024 alone. That's like an 85% plus jump. There's clearly a strong belief that AI can help Web3 deliver on promises like reducing fraud, increasing transparency.
Sounds great on paper. But here's where it gets really interesting. What are the catches? The potential downsides of mixing AI with decentralization.
Yeah, this is where the sources raise some really important flags. What's fascinating is the set of ethical and security challenges it throws up. Big concerns about AI bias, for instance. If your training data is biased, you could end up embedding inequality right into your dApps or your DAO governance.
Dangerous.
Very. Data privacy in decentralized AI systems. That's another thorny area. And then there are new threats emerging, like really sophisticated AI-powered phishing scams. Plus, the sources note that just collecting good quality data for AI training might be harder in a decentralized way compared to centralized methods.
So AI isn't a magic bullet. It brings its own baggage, and decentralized systems might struggle to manage that baggage effectively.
That's the worry. And another point raised is that the intense focus and funding on AI Web3 might be sucking the air out of the room for other critical areas,
Like
fundamental protocol scaling or just improving basic UX across the board. It could create these imbalances, neglecting foundational stuff.
Okay, AI fusion is big. What's next on the tech trend list?
DePINs, Decentralized physical infrastructure networks. This whole idea of using decentralized networks to run real-world stuff. The sources see potential for mainstream adoption here in 2025 through consumer apps, enterprise deals.
Give us some examples again. What kind of physical infrastructure are we talking about?
Things like decentralized wireless networks, helium is often mentioned, mapping services like HiveMapper, energy grids, logistics networks, even satellite internet SpaceCoin gets a nod for launching a satellite. The goal is basically to use decentralized ownership and coordination to make this infrastructure cheaper, more efficient than the old centralized ways.
That feels incredibly ambitious. Linking blockchain directly to physical hardware and services.
It absolutely is. And the sources consistently highlight a critical challenge for DePINs. They live or die by their token economics.
How so?
Well, their success depends entirely on attracting enough people or businesses willing to actually provide and maintain that physical infrastructure, setting up hotspots, driving mapping routes, whatever it is. And getting them to do that relies completely on the token rewards being attractive and sustainable.
Ah, right.
The sources explicitly warn about this. If the token rewards are too inflationary just to get people in the door early on, the token's value could crash later. That leads to contributors leaving, and the whole thing can collapse. A death spiral.
So the tokenomics design isn't just an incentive layer. It's literally existential for DePIN projects.
Exactly. The sources stress this is way more critical for DePINs than for purely digital projects because you're incentivizing real-world cost and effort. Plus, they face unique regulatory hurdles dealing with existing telecom regs, mapping laws, energy rules, on top of whatever Web3 regulations apply.
Double the compliance headache. Okay, third big trend.
RWA, tokenization, real-world assets. Bringing stuff like real estate, commodities, maybe even intellectual property onto the blockchain as tokens. The main goals are boosting liquidity for assets that are normally hard to sell quickly and maybe opening up access through fractional ownership.
This feels like prime territory for traditional finance, for institutions to get involved.
Totally. And the sources show that happening. Funding for RWA startups jumped 150% in 2024, hitting $2 billion total. You've got major players like BlackRock launching actual RWA funds. That's a big signal. The potential value is often talked about in trillions, unlocking the value tied up in these underlying assets.
Trillions always gets attention. But this raises an important question. What needs to be in place for RWA tokenization to really scale beyond just pilots or closed systems? What are the roadblocks?
The sources are pretty clear on this. You need really robust legal frameworks. Ones that reliably, legally link that digital token to the actual physical asset it represents.
The token has to mean something legally.
Exactly. And just as critical, clear, enforceable ways to resolve disputes, especially across different countries. Without that legal clarity and enforcement, big institutions might hesitate to go all in beyond limited experiments. Like the sources say, tokenizing a house is one thing, technically, but making sure that token legally represents ownership and that ownership can be enforced in court everywhere, that's the hard part.
So the legal and governance layers are playing catch-up with the tech.
Seems like it. And the sources also flag a potential tension here. A paradox, almost.
What's that?
If just a handful of large, regulated institutions like a BlackRock become the main issuers and custodians of these tokenized RWAs, well, you could end up concentrating power back in the hands of a few big players. Even if the underlying blockchain is decentralized, the control layer could become quite centralized. Sort of defeats the purpose, maybe?
Decentralized tech rails, but centralized control points.
Yeah.
Interesting dynamic. What else is key on the tech front?
Layer 2 scaling solutions and interoperability. L2s are crucial for handling more transactions on chains like Ethereum. Sources say L2s process like 45% of Ethereum's volume in 2024. And you're seeing Bitcoin L2s, Lightning Stacks, Merlin Chain, Rootstock gaining traction too, enabling DeFi and apps on Bitcoin.
So L2s make things faster, cheaper, essential for usability.
Definitely. But getting these different chains and L2s to talk to each other smoothly, interoperability, that's still a major challenge. You've got solutions like Polkadot, Cosmos, various cross-chain bridges trying to help assets and data move around. But it's complex, and it can be risky.
Risky how? Those bridges have been problematic, haven't they, security-wise?
Yeah. Hugely problematic historically. Responsible for massive hacks and losses, although your sources do note the losses from bridges decreased somewhat in 2024. But this brings up a critical point some voices in the sources make. Are L2s really a fundamental long-term solution, or are they more of a workaround for underlying limitations in Layer 1 blockchains themselves, like how transactions get ordered?
That's a deeper critique.
Yeah, the argument is that over-relying on L2s without continuing to evolve the base layer, the L1, could lead to an ecosystem that's overly complex, maybe even fragile in the long run.
So we get scaling, but maybe at the cost of simplicity or fundamental robustness down the line.
That's the concern being raised, and all these different L2s, while great for their own ecosystems, they also fragment the overall Web3 landscape. Users, developers, they have to navigate all this added complexity, which ties right back into the user experience problem. And yeah, security risk is systemic, especially with cross-chain stuff. A big failure on a major L2 or a key bridge could still send shockwaves through the whole system.
Got it. Okay, last major tech trend you wanted to highlight.
Decentralized identity, DID. The whole idea here is to give users back control over their own digital identity and data, move away from relying on big company databases. It uses blockchain tech, unique DID identifiers, and something called verifiable credentials, VCs, to let people prove things about themselves securely without revealing unnecessary info. Ontology and Humanity Protocol are mentioned as active players.
So like a digital passport, I control myself.
Sort of, yeah. VCs are like digitally signed, tamper-proof versions of credentials. Could be a passport, a degree, whatever issued by a trusted source, but you hold it securely maybe in your wallet.
Okay, I own my identity, control who sees what. Sounds empowering.
It does, but the sources point out a major adoption hurdle, a paradox, really.
Which is?
For DIDs to be widely useful, they need to be accepted by the existing systems.
Yeah.
Web2 platforms, traditional banks for things like KYC checks, and guess who the sources list as sources of resistance to DAD adoption?
Let me guess. Those same Web2 platforms and traditional institutions.
Bingo. It's a classic chicken and egg situation. DDs need buy-in from the establishment to have real utility for users, but the establishment might resist adopting tech that threatens their control over identity data.
That's a tough knot to untangle.
It is. And the sources also mention the technical complexity for the average person. Managing DEDs, handling VCs. If the wallets and apps don't make this incredibly simple, totally abstracting away the hard stuff,
people will mess up, lose things, get frustrated.
Exactly. It could undermine the whole promise of security and control, puts immense pressure back on user experience design. Needs to be seamless.
Okay, so we've got these exciting trends, AI, DePINs, RWAs, scaling, DAD.
Yeah.
But each comes loaded with its own significant challenges. Let's confront those core problems more directly now. Your sources are pretty blunt, aren't they?
Yeah, they don't pull punches. We've touched on a lot of them. But the first big one that just persists, even with L2s, is fundamental scalability, interoperability, and performance.
Still not solved at the base layer, even for things like heavy AI processing or truly global scale apps.
It's still a work in progress. And getting different chains to work together seamlessly, that remains really hard, technically and economically. Some voices in the sources, as we noted, are even questioning if the basic blockchain architecture needs a rethink for true global scale.
Okay, let's put a pin in foundational architecture for a second. The next big problem, maybe the most damaging right now, security.
This is still Web3's Achilles heel in 2025, judging by these reports. The losses reported for 2024 are just staggering. Depending on the source, somewhere between $2.6 billion and $2.9 billion lost to hacks.
Billions, with a B. That's not just experimental projects failing, that's systemic risk.
It really is. And the sources break down how it's happening, the dominant factor, access control errors, meaning things like compromised private keys, weak operational security by teams, social engineering attacks, flawed multi-sig setups, human error or process failures leading to unauthorized access. Some reports attribute like 60%, even up to 81% of losses to these kinds of access control issues. Smart contract bugs are still a factor, but basic security hygiene failures seem to be the bigger problem.
So it's often less about super complex code exploits and more about getting the basics wrong, frequently on the human side.
The data strongly suggests that. The sources list some brutal examples. DMM Bitcoin losing $308 million, WazirX losing $230 million, and then that absolutely massive one, $1.5 billion reportedly lost from Bybit just in February 2025.
$1.5 billion in one go. That's hard to fathom.
It really highlights the scale of the risk, and maybe the most worrying thing the sources point out. Attackers are repeatedly exploiting known vulnerability.
They're not always finding new holes. They're hitting the same weak spots again and again.
That seems to be a pattern, which suggests the industry isn't effectively learning or implementing fixes system-wide. Of course, new threats are also emerging, those AI-driven phishing attacks, the looming potential of quantum computing breaking current crypto.
It feels like running just to standstill, sometimes even falling behind on security.
The incident reports suggest that mitigation involves better frameworks, more audits, real-time monitoring, but the sources really emphasize that since access control is such a huge part of the problem, security efforts need to focus heavily on user education, robust team training, better key management practices, not just code audits.
It's a people and process problem just as much as a tech problem.
Absolutely. And this cycle of known bugs being exploited repeatedly points to deeper systemic issues. Maybe pressure to ship fast, the shortage of security experts we talked about, poor knowledge sharing. Whatever it is, it severely damages trust and holds back mainstream adoption. Who wants to put their money into a system that keeps losing billions?
Which flows right into the next major hurdle: user experience, UX, onboarding. Your sources basically say Web3 is still too complex.
Oh, absolutely. For the average person, it's daunting. All the jargon, gas fees, seed phrases, dealing with wallets like MetaMask that aren't always intuitive. The whole workflow is often confusing. Your sources mention high churn rates, people try it and leave. Compared to slick Web2 apps, Web3 UX often feels slow, clunky. Browser integration isn't always smooth. Payments can be weird. Interface is confusing.
Yeah, it often feels like stepping back to the dial-up days of the internet for someone new trying this stuff.
That's a common analogy. The basic journey from novice to active user is just full of friction and potential failure points. The sources talk about solutions: guided onboarding, sensible defaults, education within the apps, much more seamless wallet experiences, maybe even models where the tech is hidden initially, an experience first, wallet later approach. But another barrier noted is simply the unclear value proposition for many apps. Why should I bother navigating all this complexity if I don't immediately see a compelling reason?
If it's hard and I don't get why I need it, yeah, I'm out.
Exactly. And this connects to something the sources call the founder factor.
Well, that.
Founders, often being deeply technical and immersed in the crypto world, might just underestimate how huge these UX challenges are for regular people. They might see simplifying onboarding as, like, grunt work instead of a critical part of the product. It's a cultural thing almost.
So it's not just about hiring designers, it's a mindset shift needed across the board.
It seems so. And then there's that argument you sometimes hear, well, it's decentralized, so no one entity is responsible for onboarding. That diffusion of responsibility can really slow down ecosystem-wide UX improvements. Individual projects might get better, but without standardized, user-friendly foundational layers, wallets, network interactions, it remains a collective action problem. Nobody feels fully responsible for fixing the overall user journey.
Everyone's building their own piece, but the roads connecting them are still bumpy for the user. Okay, what about that talent gap we touched on earlier? Still a major problem.
Huge problem. The demand for skilled people just keeps soaring. We mentioned Solidity, Rust devs, security, compliance. The workforce grew massively. Yes, 100K added last year, over 460K total now. Expected to grow maybe another 30% this year.
Impressive numbers.
They are, but it's still not enough. The shortage is severe, drives up salaries, creates fierce competition. We mentioned Japan needing 20K people. It's a fundamental constraint on the entire industry.
And that shortage must directly hamstring efforts to fix security and UX, right?
Absolutely. The sources explicitly link the talent gap to the inability to fully address these core problems. Projects fight for the few available experts. That can lead to delays, or worse, cutting corners on security or UX because the right people just aren't available.
And you mentioned TradFi poaching talent.
Yeah, the sources note traditional finance firms are paying a significant premium, maybe up to 30% more for Web3 talent compared to crypto-native startups, which raises this risk. Are the best people getting pulled away from the smaller, potentially more innovative, decentralized projects towards bigger, maybe more conservative institutions?
Potentially centralizing talent and maybe slowing down the really disruptive stuff.
It's a possible consequence the sources point towards. It validates the space, sure, but it's also a challenge for the native ecosystem trying to keep its top builders.
Okay, let's talk ethics. AI bias, privacy, environment. These are big societal concerns. How do they play out in Web3, according to your sources?
Well, bringing AI into decentralized systems definitely surfaces ethical issues. The risk of biased training data creating discriminatory outcomes in dApps or DAOs is a major one mentioned. Data privacy is inherently complex when you're dealing with potentially decentralized data collection for AI. And job displacement due to automation is also flagged as a concern.
And the environmental debate, proof of work versus proof of stake.
That's still a hot topic. The shift to proof of stake is positive. Sources expect maybe half of networks to use energy-efficient consensus by 2025. But the sources also rightly broaden the discussion beyond just consensus. They talk about e-waste from hardware mining rigs, sure, but also TEP nodes and the energy needed for all that decentralized storage and computation, even on POS chains.
So green blockchain is more complicated than just flipping a switch from POBU to POS.
It's definitely a wider life cycle issue. And the sources raise a tough question about enforcement. How do you actually enforce ethical AI frameworks in a truly decentralized system? There's no central body to punish a biased model. Could lead to really fragmented ethical standards.
A challenge baked into decentralization itself. Okay, finally, market volatility. That's just part of the territory. But how is it impacting things now?
Oh yeah, inherently volatile. The sources make that very clear. Price drops, general economic uncertainty, they affect everything. Project funding, hiring plans, investor mood, whether projects can even stay afloat.
But despite that, the long-term growth forecasts are still strong, and VC money is still coming in, even if it's more selective now.
Right. It suggests this split view. Accept the short-term bumps because of belief in the long-term potential. Investors need that long view. However, the sources also point out that this volatility hits infrastructure projects and public goods development hardest. Things that need stable, long-term funding and aren't about quick token pumps.
So the instability makes it tougher to build the essential foundations the ecosystem needs.
Exactly. And these wild market swings and hype cycles can sometimes drive development based purely on speculation, chasing the latest hot trend, rather than focusing resources on solving fundamental problems like security or UX, a potential misallocation of effort.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot, the dynamic landscape, the exciting tech, but also these really serious, persistent problems. So let's circle back to the core question you asked us to tackle from these sources. Is Web3 still viable? Is it still worth investing time, money, attention in 2025?
Based purely on the analysis within these sources, the answer seems to be yes, but it's a very qualified, very nuanced yes. It is definitely not a space for just throwing money around blindly anymore. It demands a much more selective, strategic approach.
So forget the hype cycles, forget vague concepts. What should someone be looking for based on these reports? What are the positive signals in a project or sector?
The sources keep coming back to a few key things. First and foremost, clear, real-world utility. Does it actually solve a real problem? Does it create tangible value for users or businesses, something beyond just the token price?
Moving from speculation to actual function. Makes sense.
Exactly. Second, strong tech fundamentals and sustainable tokenomics. The technology needs to be sound, and the token model has to be designed thoughtfully to avoid those death spirals or other pitfalls. Third, excellent user experience, or at least a very clear, credible plan to get there. The sources really hammer this home, the need for invisible Web3, making it seamless for the user.
Hiding the complexity, making it feel as easy as using a good Web2 app.
Precisely. Then you need to look at the team. Are they experienced? Are they transparent? Do they have a track record? A focus on regulatory compliance is also becoming increasingly crucial as the space matures. You can't just ignore it. And finally, look for signs of a strong, engaged community and a healthy surrounding ecosystem, often good indicators of long-term health.
Okay, so it boils down to focus on fundamentals, real utility, usability, solid teams, compliance, community, not just the buzzwords.
That's the strategic shift these sources advocate. They advise against just investing broadly in Web3 as a concept. Instead, you need to do deep dives into specific niches. Maybe infrastructure plays like L2s or a long-term bet on the underlying plumbing. Application layer investments need to show clear market fit, real user growth, solving actual problems.
It really sounds like 2025 isn't just another year. It feels like a make or break moment where the potential has to start translating into reality.
It definitely feels pivotal reading these sources. The industry's success, its path to mainstream adoption, seems to hinge entirely on tackling these big challenges head-on: security, UX, scaling, talent. It needs to turn all that undeniable tech potential into tangible, everyday value for a much broader audience. Seeing continued institutional money flow in, seeing more real enterprise adoption, those are the key signs of maturity everyone's watching for. So for those willing to do the hard work, navigate the risk with open eyes, be patient, do the research. These sources suggest 2025 still holds significant strategic opportunities within Web3.
A landscape defined by that constant tension. Massive potential versus massive hurdles. High stakes, definitely.
Makes it a fascinating space to track, that's for sure. And thinking about that path forward, especially that point about needing to make Web3 invisible for mass adoption.
Right, hiding all the complicated bits.
It really leads to a final important question for you, the listener, to chew on. If abstracting away complexity is so crucial for mainstream users, how will the truly decentralized projects, the ones that might inherently need users to, say, manage their own keys directly or understand more the underlying mechanics, how will they compete? How do they compete against more centralized solutions that can offer that super simple, familiar Web 2-like experience, even if those solutions are just built on top of decentralized infrastructure?
Mm.
Is the future of mass adoption truly decentralized in spirit and practice? Or does it end up looking more like a kind of Web 2.5, a slicker interface built on decentralized rails, but maybe sacrificing some core decentralization principles for ease of use?
That's the fundamental tension, isn't it? Can pure decentralization and mass market usability truly coexist?
Yeah.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for sharing these sources with us, letting us dig into the state of Web3 in 2025. A lot to unpack there.
My pleasure. It's certainly a space that demands ongoing deep dives.
And that is our deep dive for today. We really hope this analysis, drawn strictly from the sources you provided, helps you navigate this incredibly complex and fast-moving landscape. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.